And before I start, I want to say thanks to some people as well. Again, just to repeat, thanks to the ESRC and to the Ulster Farmers Union for funding to undertake this research. And also just to point out that this was a joint ARK module. And I just want to thank the team there, particularly Lizanne Downs, who drafted the proposal with me, and Paula Devine and Katrina Lloyd for all their help with the analysis. And I also want to thank Roisin Kelly for her help as I was preparing this presentation. Just to give you an overview of what I'm going to do today, I'm going to start by just outlining why we felt it was important to look at public attitudes to the countryside and the rationale behind it. And then I should really say that this is a very rich data set. So for the seminar today, just given time restraints, I'm just going to focus on three particular issues, which are quite topical, I think, and of general interest. The first one I'm going to look at is the whole question of farmers and farming, and whether people see them as a drain on resources and so on, or whether they see them as a positive feature within the countryside. I'm also going to explore basically what respondents said about who owns the countryside in terms of, is it private or public property? We see a lot of disputes between farmers as private landowners and the general public wanting public access to the countryside. So I'm going to look a little bit at that, and also in terms of responsibilities. If it's private or public responsibility, if it's private or public property, that brings private or public responsibilities. So I'm going to look at that. And I'm also going to look at the rural living. And this is, if you like, the chocolate box romantic idea of rural life. And just to see how people do perceive life in rural areas, and to explore that and some of the complexities a little bit. And then I'll make some conclusions. Well, why look at public attitudes to the countryside? Why is this an important research question, or important to the general public? And the main rationale for this came about because, as you're all well aware, there's been considerable change in the policy environment that regulates agriculture and rural development and what happens in rural areas generally. There's been considerable dismantling of the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP reforms, as we refer to them. And these reforms have really been going on at various levels since Ray McSharry in the early 90s made a serious attempt to reform the CAP until the Fischler reforms in 2003, when subsidies were decoupled from production. But basically, in a nutshell, it became clear that the CAP had been a successful policy in terms of funding or ensuring that people on farms had a decent standard of living, excuse me, and that the rest of us had a stable food supply. But it was problematic, it was expensive, there was kind of moral outcry about food mountains. It created differences in terms of social class because it funded people on the basis of production, so the more you produced, the more you gave. But the main impetus for dismantling the CAP was that it was just too expensive to implement in an enlarged Europe. But at the same time, you see a change in the policy rhetoric. Fischler, you see the European policy documents, all start talking about how farmers will be subsidised to produce goods of public benefit. That the farmers must be producing public goods valued by the public. We see the same thing in the UK with the Curry report, which underlines the need for farmers to engage with the public and to ensure they're producing goods of public benefit. And we see Tony Blair's introduction to that report and various addresses to the NFU, where he's emphasising this whole idea that farmers will only be subsidised to produce goods of public benefit and things the public value. And then this begs the question, well, what do the public value? And do we know? And this was the rationale for this survey, to try and see what is it that people value about what farmers do, what are the public goods they think they produce, and secondly, what are the public views to the countryside? because a key element of the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy is that a lot more emphasis is going to be put into rural development and, if you like, area-based development more generally. I'm starting, as I said, with farmers and farming and whether they're a drain or a gain for the countryside. And sometimes, and I'm going to give some brief examples now, there is this negative image of farmers portrayed in the media, the sense that that farmers gain at the expense of the general public, and certainly other qualitative research I would have done with farming families would reinforce this, where farmers would say they often feel, you know, they're producing on very low profits, struggling financially, and, you know, all they receive is kind of farmer bashing. And in a sense, I think that kind of thing is almost what underpins this policy rhetoric on ensuring that farmers are subsidised to provide goods valued by the public. There's almost a hint in there that they're not doing that, or there's these kinds of tensions, which is obvious when you look. This is Jonathan Guthrie writing in the Financial Times just a few weeks ago, and it was an article about how to reduce environmental damage in rural areas. And he says, a simpler solution would be for central government to abolish farm subsidies. Despite tying up a stonking 75% of the UK landmass, agriculture generates a measly 1% of GDP. Take away the 3 billion or so in grants paid out under the cap, and many farms would be abandoned. Similarly, last week, Mary Rafferty had a piece in the Irish Times with the similar kind of vein of kind of the public against farmers. And she was talking about the staggering amounts of subsidies paid to farmers and how this is shortly about to be blown open because there's going to be a register created of farmers and the amount of subsidies they receive. So I guess I'm giving this as a backdrop to see whether this is the view that's reflected by the survey. And it's not. You know, you have basically 90% of people saying that farms and farm families keep the countryside alive. You've 91% of people saying farming as a way of life should not be allowed to die out. You've over 70% of people disagreeing that farmers are only concerned with making money and don't care about the countryside. And interestingly, you've 45% of people disagreeing that farmers are subsidised too much. And just to explain that, there was 21% of people who didn't agree or disagree with that figure, and 13% didn't know. And I was actually surprised. It was only 13% of people said they didn't know whether farmers are subsidised too much or not. Again, I think this is really interesting. As, again, probably you're all aware, the majority of farms in Northern Ireland could not survive without subsidies. And when we asked people which of three statements came closest to their views about the level to which farmers should be subsidised, 68% believed that farmers should be subsidised to some degree to help farmers survive, but obviously not at any cost. But again, that figure I think is quite a bit higher than we might have expected. But the one that surprised me is that 23% said that farms in Northern Ireland should be preserved at all costs. And again, what's interesting about this is that there is no difference in opinion regardless of whether or not respondents lived in urban or rural areas. We also asked whether modern methods of farming have caused damage to the countryside, and you can see that 47% of people either agreed or agreed strongly with that, while 20% disagreed or disagreed strongly. Again, there's little difference here by where people lived. Except it's interesting to note that more people who live in farms or in houses in the country and people who live in cities are likely to agree that modern methods of farming have caused damage to the countryside than people who live in suburbs or small cities and towns. But I think what's interesting about that excuse me, is that clearly farmers do have an understanding of how modern methods of farming have caused damage to the countryside. It's not that, you know, farmers are denying this while everybody else is aware of it. Excuse me, I'm leaving farmers now, and well, I'm not leaving farmers, but I'm moving on to look at this whole question of who owns the countryside, whether it's private or public property. I mean, there are many user groups and interest groups who stake a claim on the countryside and stake a claim of ownership. And this becomes important because the state regulates the use of the countryside, and who can claim ownership can influence policy. And really, the reality is, the countryside is both public and private property. I mean, farms are private property, farmers own them, they work them for economic, they're places of production, they're worked for economic return, they can be passed intergenerationally, they can be bought and sold. There's also publicly accessible property, where we can go for walks and picnics and so on. Although, and I'm not going to get into this, but much of that is actually owned by the state. But I guess the countryside has many functions. It's a place of leisure, of recreation, place of production. You can look at developers who want to use the land to build houses, and we'll see that many people would prefer to live in the countryside a little bit later on. Environmentalists would claim a stake on the countryside as a public good, in the sense that we're caretakers and we must all maintain rural biodiversity for current and future generations. But again, you often see this, you see tensions between these user groups. For example, we have a PhD student in the School of Sociology in Queen's who's currently doing a PhD looking at pesticide usage, and the fact that public perception seems to very much focus on pesticide usage in agriculture and the damage that does the land. Whereas she's interested in looking at pesticide usage of recreational use, like football pitches and golf clubs, where there's actually much heavier usage of pesticides, and it's far less regulated than it is in agriculture. But still, the perception tends to be that it's farmers through pesticide usage that are damaging the land. I guess one of the things that we were interested in as well was that if you're going to make a claim to ownership, it brings with it responsibility. And really looking at that whole question of whether it's private or public property and the responsibilities that brings with it, and whether people are taking on those responsibilities. And I guess again, we were also interested in looking at the tensions, in the sense that it's usually presented as, a tension between private property, farmers who own the land, and the public who want access to go for picnics and so on. I mean, just to give you two quick examples of that. One was reported in a paper here years ago. It was Kay Milton, an anthropologist in Queen's, used this in one of her studies, where this family went to have a picnic in the countryside in a farmer's field. And he came over to them and basically said, you should really have asked for my permission. This is private property if you're going to have a picnic here. And it got a bit heated. And they were basically saying they had every right to have a picnic in the countryside if they wished. This was, their right, it was public property. And the farmer followed them home. And the following Saturday, he and his wife and their two daughters had a picnic in this family's front garden. So it was just this whole thing of what's private and what's public property. My own favourite actually was reported in The Guardian, where a group of hill walkers arrived into this farmer's farmyard, and it got very heated, and they were basically arguing again their right to walk through his farmyard. He was obviously very much disputing this, and one hill walker said it was their right to experience the authentic smell of the countryside, at which point the farmers started pelting them with manure and told them they could take the authentic smell of the countryside home with them. But he was charged with assault. I'm not sure whether he was convicted or not. So to move on to look at some of this public-private perception of who owns the countryside, one of the questions we asked was, suppose it is discovered that some waste from a farm has begun leaking into a nearby river, what should happen with the farmer? And you can see there that almost 70% are suggesting a sanction of some kind, either a fine every week while it continues, or shutting down the farm entirely. So this would seem to suggest it's private property, it's a private responsibility, the farmer is privately responsible for meeting with this. There were some rural-urban differences here. It was more likely that people on farms and living on the country took a laissez-faire approach, where farmers would be just asked to do something about it. But still we can see that there is this sense that this is a private responsibility, and a majority are saying that farmers should be responsible for doing that. But when it comes to looking after the countryside more generally, and here we're asking about public good and asking who should be responsible for footing the bill for this, the largest groups say that the general public through income tax and VAT should be responsible for paying for this. And then it moves on to everyone who lives in the countryside through their rates. So again, there seems to be a kind of difference here in terms of public-private ownership and responsibility. This is one of the ones personally that I find most interesting because farmers, as we all know, are having to incur quite a lot of costs around meeting the costs of the Nitrates Directive and the Water Framework Directive. And we see that 60% of people are saying that the farmers should receive financial support from the government in meeting those costs. But what I find even more interesting is that over double, 27% of people are saying the government should foot this cost on its own, as opposed to farmers footing the cost on its own. And this seems to me to suggest a very kind of sophisticated understanding, which somehow gets lost, I think, in media reports, that, you know, water quality, air quality and so on are public goods, and there is a sense that the public are willing to share the cost for these goods. Again, we were trying to get at, you know, this whole perception of public-private property and so on. So we asked, if there's a rarely used public footpath running through farmland, should the farmer be able to get it closed? And a majority thought the farmer should not have the right to do this. 51% saying probably should not or definitely should not have the right. So even though it's rarely used, but it is a public pathway, a majority think that he, and there's no point trying to be politically correct about calling farmers he, you know, 94% of them are, so I'm not going to get tied up about that. But when we look at it, the footpath now from being rarely used becomes regularly used, and it's an access to shops, but farm animals are getting out. And interestingly, in this situation, 63% now think that the farmer should have the right to close the footpath. And again, I think this represents a more sophisticated understanding of public-private rights. And what seems to be happening here is that if it is interfering with the farmer's private property and the public are not taking responsibility around closing gates, then they think the farmer does have the right to close this off. This one is interesting, I think, because we have 36% of people disagreeing that farmers have too much say in the countryside, while 19% agree that they do. But this is where there's a large difference depending on where you live. 48% of rural dwellers strongly disagreed that farmers have too much say, whereas 33% of urban dwellers disagreed or strongly disagreed. So more urban people agree that farmers have too much say. Right. I'm going to move on just to say a little bit about the rural idyll, or this romantic view of rural life. This very much dates back to industrialization, you know, when we had large manufacturing outlets developing in the 1800s, when, you know, we had new cities being developed, many of which had poor facilities. If you look at art and literature around this idea, you see this very romantic idea of rural life emerging. You know, this place where there's a strong sense of community, a sense of belonging, shared goals and values. There's a German sociologist called Ferdinand Tönnies who should bear a great deal of the responsibility for this. But it's very much this view of the rural idyll, of perfect rural life. Excuse me. That work has since been disputed, and there was research done in the late 60s by Roald Dahl, where he basically just said, you know, there's a real problem with this. Rural areas are as divided by social class, by economics, by power, by gender differentials as urban areas. And you have equally strong communities in urban areas and senses of belonging and so on, as you do in rural areas. It's been a very difficult image to kind of burst or explore in more detail. And it's important because this sense of shared values and sense of community and belonging very much underpins rural development programs. So it actually is important in terms of the rationale for a lot of rural development initiatives. I couldn't help including some of these romantic, poetic images of rural areas. So we have Wendell Berry, "When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free." And we've, other examples like W.B. Yeats and Wordsworth and the daffodils and Montague's The Windhart. Of course, we do have grumpy old Patrick Kavanagh from Monaghan, who, having to live in the country, back once again in wet, wild Monaghan, or wild, wet Monaghan, exiled from thought and feeling. A mean brutality reigns. It is really a horrible position to be in, and I equate myself with Dante and all who have lived outside civilization. And of course, you may or may not be familiar with his stony grey soil of Monaghan, where basically he maintains like rural Monaghan stole his youth. And the only thing I find amazing is that they built a heritage centre to him. In terms of the rural idyll, we asked people where they lived and where they would like to live, and blue indicates where people currently live, and the purple where people would like to live. And as you can see, there's a much greater desire to live on a farm or in a home in the country. Only 7% of people said they would live in a big city if they could choose, while 29% of people said they would live on a farm or a home in the country if they could choose. So overall, 68% of respondents live in urban areas, but only 45% would choose to live there if they had a choice. 32% of the sample currently live in rural areas, but 55% would choose to live there if they had a choice. See, 65% of people agreed strongly that there's less crime in the countryside. And this was something we checked out with PSNI statistics and NICVA, and this is true. There are 1,000 people in rural areas compared with mixed rural, urban, and urban. There is less crime in the countryside. This one I find really interesting because you have 44% of people agreeing strongly that it's harder to get a good job if you live in the countryside, and 35% disagreeing, and 18% neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Now I find that quite, kind of an ambivalent response, given that, if you look at the DARD Equality Impact Assessment or PwC's recent study on rural policy, or the whole rationale of the LEADER Rural Development Programme, very much the information these reports are giving us is that the labour market in rural areas is more restricted, it's more difficult for people to get good jobs, that younger people are having to commute, and this is an issue in terms of regional development that needs to be taken seriously. 75% said that they agreed strongly that the countryside is a better place to bring up children. And again, that's almost intuitive, but it was one that I found particularly interesting because of qualitative research that I have been involved in over the past number of years. Roisin Kelly and I were involved in looking at the Common Agricultural Policy reforms and what it meant for people on farms and people in rural areas. And one of the things that came out of that quite strongly was that people on farms felt incredible stress around childcare, both in terms of trying to manage children on farms, or if they were a little bit older and both parents were working off the farm, maybe having to leave children a little bit younger than they might have liked. Work I've just finished for the Health and Safety Executive. Again, people on farms were saying they felt considerable stress around children doing work on farms that they really felt they shouldn't be doing, but because of the financial situation and so on, they didn't see any option around that. Lots of rural development groups we would have interviewed, and particularly rural women's groups, would have identified limited childcare in rural areas as a major issue, impeding women's participation in the labour market. Work I did with the Rural Development Council showed real concern about the need to have increased activities for teenagers in rural areas. So it would seem that people are obviously weighing up these difficulties, but still concluding that the countryside is a better place to bring up children. Only 14% of people agreed that the countryside is very boring. And consistently across all age groups, people disagreed with this, although it was slightly higher for older age groups. So you're less likely to find the countryside boring as you get older. Again, almost 90% of people agreed strongly that the countryside provides a healthier environment to live in. And again, that seems fairly intuitive, but from the qualitative research that I and some of my colleagues have been in, you know, there's the stress and mental well-being issues around living in the countryside have been highlighted. I mean, farming is one of the occupations with the highest rate of suicide. You know, there's a lot of information about the financial stress and worries farmers have to experience and isolation. Rural people more generally have talked about the additional travel that they must undertake on a daily basis just around accessing schools, work and so on. And one of our MSc students in sociology just finished a thesis looking at the detrimental implications for people in rural areas of having to travel further to health services. So again, there would seem to be, that seems to be a more complex issue than indicated. This is my final slide before I conclude. 70% agreed strongly that there's more community spirit in the countryside. And again, as I've said already, a lot of rural development programs are premised on this, that there's this holistic understanding of the needs of rural areas. And when we look at community spirit and the work of some political science scholars like Putnam, basically we're talking about participation, a sense of belonging, a sense of engagement. But any of you who have had a chance to look at the update in your pack will note that there's not necessarily evidence to support that there is more community spirit in rural areas than in urban areas. Life and Times module on democratic participation would actually suggest that there is higher participation in civic and social activities in urban areas. Not hugely, but it is higher in terms of undertaking voluntary work, organising charity events and engaging in politics. So, to conclude, I think it's clear that in general the public are supportive of farmers and farming, and that they do perceive that farmers are producing goods of public benefit. I think there's a much more complex view of ownership of the countryside and responsibility for the countryside and for the public goods produced more generally than frequently presented in the media. There is a sense that we are all responsible for the countryside, I think, at some level. And I think the rural idyll, this romantic view of life in rural areas, is a lively.
Thanks very much, Sally. I found that fascinating. I've been away and haven't had a chance to actually read the update, so it was my first time to hear it, and I really found it very interesting. I know many of you in the audience come from different backgrounds, some working in rural areas and with rural groups and so on, and others from academia and other resources. But I'm sure you have some comments, questions, or observations that you'd like to raise, and welcome any questions or comments you have.
Sally, the sort of differences by age, I mean, are younger people live in rural areas less disposed?
Yeah, and in general, no. I mean, there was a slight difference in terms of whether or not they found the countryside boring, but a majority of all the younger age groups still did not think it was more boring. And similarly, in terms of whether the countryside is a better place to bring up children. That was one where I anticipated there might be a difference by age, but there wasn't. There was kind of uniformity across the age groups that people do think the countryside is a better place to bring up children.
So yeah, that's very, very interesting. I actually rearranged my day so I could be here because I'm very interested in issues to do with the countryside. Got probably 4 questions.
Okay, let me get a pen then, Chris.
The first one is, for the purposes of this study, what was the countryside? Where was it? In particular, I'm interested in the extent to which this included coastal areas, because the coastal areas are experiencing some of the most dramatic changes on this island at the moment. And I notice in figure 1, when you've got area of residence, you've got under 20% specified as living in a big city, but we know that 1 in 6 people in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, lives in Belfast. So that seems a bit odd, the categorisation you have in there. Belfast city population is 300,000, so surely that's much higher than the actual distribution. And if you include other parts of Belfast metropolitan area, such as Lisbon, Newton Abbey, etc., big city and suburbs should add up to over 60% of the population. So I'm a bit confused. So it may just be a technical definitional thing. The second question, again, it may just be technical definitional, is that you've very much focused on farmers in the countryside. Now, of course, even whatever definition we use of the countryside, farmers only constitute a small minority of the people who live in the countryside. Most new housing development in Northern Ireland in recent years has been one-off detached houses in the countryside. So most of the people who live in the countryside aren't farmers, and I wonder if it's possible to disaggregate responses on the basis of occupational categories rather than just place of residence. And I won't take up too much time with other comments. That when people are asked about attitudes, should farming be preserved at all costs, were they are given the alternatives, such as like closing children's hospitals? That's
Say that again, Chris.
Well, that's at all costs, isn't it? Farming should be preserved at all costs. Therefore, we have to limit our resource expenditure. So should we stop having children's hospitals? Should we withdraw support for educational services? What trade-off would be made? So when people are asked questions about what should be done at all costs, I wonder what it actually means.
All right, okay. Okay, thanks for those. And I mean, Lizanne, maybe you can help with some of the more technical questions. In terms of a definition of the countryside, there wasn't a definition of the countryside given as such, but it was generally, and you can see from the questions that I've used, and obviously I've only drawn on it, that it's very much about public areas that are accessed and about farming being the kinds of what we're talking about in terms of the countryside. And in terms of your third question, which relates to that, we have asked quite a lot of questions in the survey about planning, green belt areas, detached dwellings, whether people should be allowed to build these houses and so on. But obviously, just for time restraints today, I haven't gone into that. But you're quite right that farmers are only a certain percentage of people living in the countryside, and there is a lot more information in the survey about that. But nonetheless, I mean, part of the rationale was around this whole public policy debate that farmers should only be subsidised to produce goods of public benefit, or that this seems to be the way it's going. So that was kind of the rationale for it. I mean, of course, we didn't ask people whether farmers should be subsidised at the cost of closing children's hospitals. You know, I mean, Lizanne, I mean, I don't know if you want to take up on how that might be.
Well, to the countryside definitional thing, first of all, the interviewers would be brief. The countryside is whatever people think it means. So if somebody says, do you want the countryside to say it's whatever you think it means, and we're all brief on that, right? On the distribution of area of residence, again, that's self-defined. The question is the area where you live in a big city, the suburbs or outskirts of a big city, a small city, a town, a village, or a farm in the country, and people would then define themselves. Now, some people, even living in Belfast, or Derry, perhaps wouldn't necessarily say that it's a big city, but that's we took the definitions that people accepted themselves. On the question on the children's hospitals, no, they weren't said, you know, the question simply said at all costs, end of story. Whatever people think that means, that is what it means. We didn't sort of give a trade-off. You realise this would mean
X pence in income tax or closer to, you know, maybe would you choose this over this or this over that? So that's the context of that particular question.
I think, Chris, in terms of how the urban-rural is defined overall, 68% of the respondents were classified as living in rural areas, or in urban areas, and 32% in rural areas. That's class in big city suburbs and small city town together.
Okay, any other questions? Comments? I have one, keep in mind, taking care of. The findings around the choice of where people say they would like to live, which seems to show that everybody wants to live in a farm or a country, is Northern Ireland unique? Or is this, if you ask these questions in another part of the UK or in France or in, I don't know, China, would you get the same answers, or do we know?
Well, I think that's really interesting because I just happened to come across a study carried out in the Built Environment and Planning Department in UCD, University College Dublin yesterday, and the headline was something like rural dwellers are happiest. And it was a piece of work that they had done, again, which seemed to indicate that people were much more content if they lived in rural areas. I think this is fairly universal, but I think it's universal insofar as, excuse me, many people want to live within commuting distance of the city, and it's a particular type of rural living. You know, I mean, the areas that are in difficulties are precisely what Chris is talking about, coastal regions or remote rural regions, which are continually suffering depopulation, and you're not going to have commuters moving there. And so, I mean, rural areas need to be stratified as well by kind of, you know, semi-urban and remote. But I think in terms of this rural little and more people wanting to live in the countryside, I think you would. Yeah.
Thanks. Anyone else have comments?
Just a couple of comments. Graham Fury from the Farmers Union. I really welcome, you know, some of the, obviously, the results of that survey, you know, kind of gives you that kind of belief and faith that maybe people aren't all against this after all. Which is the headline stuff that you see from time to time, becomes more regular, and with operations on, and you hear it on programs all the time, how people are complaining about farmers holding up traffic, there's great smell, as you said, things like that. It is welcome that at the end of the day, I think people do realise that that's where their food comes from, and their priorities in life, really, that way. So we would welcome the results of the survey. Obviously, that can't be extrapolated, but just how definitive they are. One of the comments I would take, and just going from the last question, is that people who actually like to live in the countryside and things like that, it's about like having your cake and being able to eat it. You know, how many of those people would actually then school their children in the town, go to you know, things like that? They use the local shop or come back into the city, and how many of those people actually have two homes, one at home in the countryside and a home in the town, and things like that there. And in other words, do they want to live in the country but have the city life, if you like, or the city amenities and all that there? Now, from the countryside, if people in the countryside that live and work in the countryside probably feel like they have a house in the city as well, you know, if you're in a two-house thing. But certainly from people who live in the countryside, and that's the attitude, and sometimes the problems that we see as farmers, is that the person wants the rural life and the idyllic life that you suggest that is still out there, but they want all the benefits of the city.
I mean, this was something that PricewaterhouseCoopers reported on in their review of rural policy from consultation with various groups, and they identified this as a tension. That, you know, many people are commuting their kids into school, using childcare in urban areas. So it's also a social class issue because they can afford to do this. So it's putting less pressure on government to actually ensure that these provisions are available in rural areas. And they also raised the whole question of some tensions around integration, because people, it's a dormitory type of stuff. You're living in the countryside but working in urban areas.
And one point maybe was the access, that, you know, where people feel they are with access to the countryside, not as who owns the countryside or who owns the land, you know. Northern Ireland is slightly different probably from some of the other countries across the water, and that it is owned by quite a number of landowners, you know, and they're small landowners, and the boundaries aren't that definitive in a way. I mean, marsh hedges or anything, quite often dog legs and everything, where in a lot of other countries it's squared off everywhere, and people
That's right.
know exactly where they are and all the rest. And pathways is an interesting one, and rights of way, because we maybe don't have the same problems that they have from the agriculture side that they have in England with rights of ways to cross vast tracts of farmland. But rights of ways can be an issue. You know,
Well, it's an issue in terms of responsibility.
well, it's interesting the response that you got even on that there, you know, where people felt that, you know, if the public were abusing the pathway by leaving gates open, that they would be happy to have them closed. Thought that was quite an interesting result there.
Quite, it's one of that one, and just ask if, you know, I'd be very surprised if that survey were to be done in England, that you would get such a high percentage of people that generally approved of the idea that if a path was being misused, that it would be legitimate to block it. I'd be very surprised if you get that number. Can you have any ideas why is that happening?
Why is that?
Because
Yeah.
is it because for so long it's been based in people's understanding of the countryside that as long as it's a footpath in England you can use it, whereas there are so many fewer rights of way across farming land?
I mean, yeah, I was interested in that generally, and there were other things in the survey, like for example, the vast majority of people knew that agriculture here is 3 times more important to the economy than in Britain. Excuse me. I'm guessing. I don't know that people would be able to say that for the manufacturing sector or the service industry, how many times it is more or less important. And I think it's partly that, you know, it's small. I think most people have some connection with the land. They'll have some relative who lives on a farm, or, you know, they're not that many generations removed from maybe having grandparents or something on the land. Because there were things like that, or most people getting right how much a farmer gets out of a pint of milk, how much profit they get. There were things, just the general knowledge that left me shocked, and I thought, I certainly wouldn't have that knowledge about any other sector. So I think there is some engagement more generally. Maybe it's the size of the region as well, and this knowledge that agriculture is economically more important to us. Maybe there is more of an understanding around that. I think there have been some, you know, well-covered public debates as well about public liability around pathways and who is responsible if there is an accident. I mean, perhaps that has increased awareness. But I agree with you, I would be surprised if you got similar results if you did the survey in Britain.
Yes, please.
I wonder if I ask a quick question, Sally. It might be beyond the remit of what you're going to talk about today, but one thing that would be very interesting to find out is what was the attitude of people to housing development in the countryside. You know, that is an issue that often comes up in the media, etc. I wondered, you know, did you get any research done on what people's attitude is really on whether this, you know, development, particularly developers moving into the countryside and developing areas, were people broadly against that, or
that there is quite a lot of stuff on that in the survey, and it's one of the areas that needs more analysis. But in general, people were very supportive of maintaining green belt type areas in the countryside. But it's one of the places, interestingly, where there is quite a significant urban-rural split, and rural people think, you know, people should be allowed to build houses as needed, and of course this is reflecting the whole public debate at the moment. Whereas urban people were more likely to say that, you know, it was really important to maintain green belts and restrict development. So there is a lot of information there that needs further exploration, but it's actually one of the areas where we are seeing a bigger urban-rural difference.
So was that before PPS 14 or so? It was carried out before?
It was 2004, so yeah.
It's like
Did you get the feeling, people thought that countryside is a very good place to bring children up? Did you get the feeling that there should be more emphasis put on keeping rural schools open, or public transport, or giving country children an equal chance of access to popular schools and towns?
You can see that, you know, there's well over, almost 3/4 of people are saying that the countryside is a better place to bring up children. In terms of asking whether about rural schools and so on, that wasn't particularly asked in this question, but in this survey. But it is an area that one of my colleagues in education, Tony Gallagher, has looked at and did a report for the Rural Community Network on precisely that question. And rural people very much do think that local schools contribute to the sense of community, the sense of belonging, and carry out much more functions than just providing their children with an education locally. And this is one of the difficulties around, for example, some rural development programs where local groups may lobby to keep their local school opened, and this may become a major activity for a local development group. But actually that decision is made centrally. I mean, that's made by the Department of Education in terms of rationalisation. Certainly rural people from Tony Gallagher's work would seem to really value schools in a very holistic way, not just in terms of education, but in the way they bring families of children of similar ages together and so on.
Any other final comments or observations?
Could I just ask Sally, just on with regard to the actual subsidisation of farmers, you know, and the responses you got to that, was that linked to actually, say, food production or care of the environment or care of the countryside? You know, with people's attitudes slightly different, if the payment was more towards an environmental scheme as opposed to a production of food scheme, if you like, or based on, obviously you said at the start, you with cap reform, you know, the fact that we're going away from production-based subsidies now. As farmers and as an organisation, we're trying to promote the fact that we're not now getting paid for producing food.
Yes.
As the care of the countryside that the public are now. And would the attitude have changed, you know, say pre-2004, even if you did the survey now? Just what's
and again, there's a lot more information in the survey on that, which I haven't presented here today. Safe food production is a priority for people. At the same time, people also felt in the future that farmers should be subsidised more around management of the environment, maintaining wildlife and so on. So there were other areas that they felt farmers should be tending to as public goods as well as food production in the future in order to not in order to be accessing subsidies, but these were the things that they felt farmers should be doing in order to be receiving subsidies. So you are quite right about that.
Did the response have a fair grasp of the fact that the countryside has been largely created by farmers and farm production systems and things like that, and the environment and countryside has basically been shaped by the type of farming that's been carried over in Northern Ireland, you know?
I mean, I can't precisely answer that question, but I can say, I mean, I think the results of this survey would suggest that people have a much greater understanding of farming, the issues that are being faced, and public responsibilities around some of the public goods that farmers produce. I mean, I think that's what's interesting about this survey, and maybe isn't quite what we expected. You know, I mean, when we asked people about what they saw as the greatest threat to farming in the future, you know, a majority said globalisation, opening up of food markets. The next highest was dismantling of the common agricultural policy. So it would seem that there is a much greater general knowledge, or maybe I'm just not great on knowledge about anything else. But I was amazed by the level of what the public knew in terms of farming.
Did you come across any regional differences in Northern Ireland? You know, sometimes we would always have a perception that further west you have more people remember issues, rural issues and farming issues.
Sure. We've broken down various findings by rural, urban. We haven't done it by region. Is it possible to do that, Liza?
The most we could do probably is east, west and Belfast. It isn't great. Once you start to break it down too much, you run into problems of confidentiality and identifying people and so on. So it's probably not possible to get a very good handle. It's worth looking at even in Belfast, but I don't know if it's really find what's good.
And is there any way of using this to look at trends? This sort of tells us, you know, sort of here and now. How do we, is there any comparators from previous years, or can you do this again or whatever?
We can have some money, yes. Sorry.
There were some questions asked in the late 80s.
And in the sort of mid-90s.
And some mid-90s, and we've tried to repeat those ones so that we can get some trend data. But it would be, 2004, it would be quite good to do it in another year's time, because things are moving really quite quickly in this policy arena. There's also comparisons with Britain. British Social Attitudes ran some of those questions, including the one on footpaths, actually.
That's right.
But it's quite old now as well. But it would be interesting to do a time series and sort of comparison with Britain, where there are common questions, you know, before. But it would be good to repeat this one again, for sure.
Sorry, yes, go ahead.
Just, did you ask respondents did they perceive themselves coming from a farming background?
We didn't ask that, no.
Maybe we should.
Yeah, that would actually be very interesting, because it would be interesting, yeah, to cross that with youth. That is interesting.
We would be able to identify those that we were identified as currently working on
Yeah.
farms. So, I mean, it would be a small percentage of total sample, obviously.
It actually would be interesting to know how many people perceive themselves as having a farming background.
Would there be any way in which you could find out if people had moved back into the countryside and were recent drives in the countryside?
We've got how long people lived in
Yeah.
the place where they live now. But we don't have that level if they're returning. You really need a more qualitative thing, I think.
Yeah, you probably would, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think our lunch has arrived. So if you've no more formal questions, Sally will be around. I'm happy to talk to you informally over lunch and just talk to each other. And thank you very much for your interest in the seminar today and for your questions and comments. As Sally said, it's a very rich data set. Obviously, she can only present a small subsection of the data in any detail today. There is a lot more, and obviously Sally will be publishing further from it. But also to encourage you to use the data as well in your organisations. The data is there, and if you are interested or have particular needs, then either contact Sally directly or contact the ARK team, and we'll be happy to try to work with you to see what can be done around those needs.